Hosting our discussion today is Stephen Bucci, Director of our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. He previously served here as a Senior Research Fellow for Defense and Homeland Security. He is well-versed in special operations and cybersecurity, as well as defense support to civil authorities. He served for 3 decades as an Army Special Forces officer and top Pentagon official. He assumed duties in 2001 as military assistant to Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld and worked daily with the Secretary for 5.5 years. Upon retirement from the Army, he continued at the Pentagon as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Homeland Defense, and America's Security Affairs. And prior to joining us here, he was a lead consultant to IBM on cybersecurity. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Steve Bucci. Steve?
Let me add my welcome to all of you here at Heritage and to those who will see this online. We're 2 days away from this year's celebration of Veterans Day. I got to speak yesterday to an entire middle school full of children about Veterans Day, which was interesting because I had to trace for them that their great-grandparents, those that had them, were potentially veterans of World War II. Their grandparents may have been veterans in the Vietnam era, and then down through their mothers, fathers, uncles, aunts, or older brothers and sisters for the present set of conflicts. Just to point out what I talked to them about, because most of them don't remember Vietnam. Some of you in this room don't remember Vietnam. Some of us do very well. America's matured a lot in its attitude towards its veterans and how it tries to help its veterans. The veterans today are different than any group of veterans before. They face some very great difficulties, some traumatic things that have occurred. We have wounds today that we have to deal with that we never really had to deal with before because, frankly, the veterans who would have experienced that level of damage in the past would have never made it home alive. But these young men and women have, and they're now reintegrating into our society. And we also have some tremendous benefits, that some of that medical technology, young men and women who've lost both their legs, they don't want a wheelchair that you push a 90-year-old around in. They want 3 or 4 wheelchairs, one to do road racing in, one that they can reach back into the bed of their pickup truck, pull it out, and get themselves out and move around, and other ones for other activities. They're different than what we've dealt with before, and they have different attitudes, and we need to have different attitudes in dealing with them. These young men and women are active, not just physically, but politically, and they are not going to sit back and just put their feet up or just fade into the shadows. They want to be a part of our society and our political landscape. But as we acknowledge on this anniversary the accomplishments, the sacrifice that our veterans have made, we also need to remember that they are a part of both the present and the future. And we've got a panel for you this afternoon that will help us understand how that group can be helped and how they can be reintegrated, because I have to tell you, and it's kind of a buzzword now for a lot of groups, our veterans today do not want a handout, but they do occasionally need a hand up. And the 3 gentlemen that we're going to hear today have some great ideas. They're already doing it. It's not theoretical. It's real for them. It is something that all of us need to be aware of too. We're going to start with Tom Meyer. He is the program manager for Veteran Services in the Philanthropy Roundtable, and he's the author of the book Serving Those Who Served. And he's going to be talking to you a little bit about that. He has a lot of experience working with military personnel. He's done academic studies through Cambridge University, or University of Cambridge, excuse me, on decision-making in counterinsurgency for young junior officers. And he's interviewed and worked with a lot of them. And so his knowledge of the military is profound, but his knowledge of philanthropy is as well. He's going to be followed by Devin Holmes, who is the CEO of Warrior Gateway. While Devin himself, I've heard him speak a lot of times, doesn't have a military background, he has a tech background. But he's taken his knowledge and applied it through the Warrior Gateway to provide a way for our warriors to reach out themselves and get help, but also to connect those who want to help with those who need it. And then lastly, we'll have Pete Hedgeseth, who's the CEO of Concerned Veterans for America. It's one of the newest and most quickly growing of veteran service organizations. I can tell you, and this is not a slam on some of the older organizations, it's not the same as the VFW or the American Legion. It's something new and vibrant for our veterans today. They reach out to all veterans, and it is a way for them to be very much involved in the politics of today, not just the things that affect them directly. It's not just all about their benefits. It's about making sure that they are a part of everything that goes on in this country. And Pete is a former military officer, served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and has 2 Bronze Stars and a Combat Infantryman's Badge. So he is not just someone talking about it, but he's experienced it, and he really lives by the saying that we use in the military, that you leave no man behind. He's making sure that all of his brothers and sisters are coming right along with him. They're going to take about 10 minutes each to do an initial presentation, and then we're going to do Q&A and get you guys involved. So with that, we'll turn it over to Tom.
Thanks, Steve. The only thing I will say about my research from a prior life is that if you ever get a chance to have an initiation ceremony into the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment of the United Kingdom, do it. It's a lot of fun. And I'm obligated not to say anything beyond that. Right, so I work for an organization called the Philanthropy Roundtable. My job is basically to help donors and foundations figure out how they can best use their philanthropic dollars when it comes to veterans and military families. And what I'll do today is sort of start out with some demographic information that we've found deeply contradicts I think what has been a dominant narrative for several years about veterans in this country. It's luckily starting to change, but I think it really sets up well what sort of good involvement with veterans looks like, and what sometimes donors and foundations can do to actually create bad outcomes and sort of perverse incentives in the reintegration process. Right, so the first myth I'll try and bust is one that when my father joined the military in the late 70s, he sort of did it because he had no other option. You know, he was in New Orleans, didn't really have any other promising leads, and so, heck, an ROTC scholarship looked like a great deal. That, for some reason, that narrative, although I love my father and he's done wonderful things with it, that narrative that folks going into the military don't have any better options just isn't true. If you look at young people today, only about 25% meet the basic qualifications for intellectual aptitude, for lack of a criminal history, for physical and mental health going into the military. So it really doesn't make sense to look at this as a low skill or a low potential population. If you look at formal education, this is before they go into the military, they also outperform their civilian peers by a pretty good margin. Basically, all of them have gone to high school at the very least, and actually more have completed some higher education, whether that's part of a 4-year degree, vocational school, 2-year degree. More of them have completed that than their civilian peers. And last, if you're looking at, and I want to make sure that I say this right, if you're looking at all veterans, right, not just post 9/11, but you're looking at all veterans, their incomes actually are 12 to 15% higher than those of their civilian, sort of same age, same skill peers. So what that tells us is that, well, if income is kind of generally correlated with skill in the workforce, these folks are really high potential, and that's how they should be treated. The reason I want to make this very clear is that this is all veterans, is that post 9/11 still are struggling with some unemployment issues, and I don't want this to gloss over that. Next up, we sort of I think probably the strongest image we see from these wars are those of physical injuries, sort of catastrophic injuries coming home that, as Steve said, many of whom wouldn't have survived in prior wars, but because of the wonderful medical advances that we have, are now. If you look at the bottom here, there's an 8-to-1 wounded to fatality ratio. Going back to Vietnam, that was about 3-to-1. World War II, that was 2-to-1. So you're much more likely to survive these days. And so we've got, for the first time, I think, images of folks coming home who've made it through these catastrophic events. And while they deserve certainly a disproportionate amount of attention because they've gone through more, I do want to highlight the fact that we can't forget about or let that narrative sort of overtake what the majority of the population experiences. I will oftentimes with my friends sort of ask, how many folks do you think have had severe, or what we call major amputations, it's anything more than a hand or a foot? And they'll say 500,000, 100,000. It's actually more like 1,800. These are from earlier this year. It hasn't jumped up that much. The same thing with burns, right? So you have a very, very small proportion of the population that is in need of tremendous help, but about 99% are not in that. And so as we think about them, and as we think about ways in which we engage them, keep that in mind. The so-called sort of invisible wounds of war are a similar, slightly more complicated story. Early on in these wars, we didn't recognize these were an issue. And now, every day in my news feed at work, I get dozens of stories about post-traumatic stress, about traumatic brain injury, about military suicide. But the stories are not all that nuanced, right? We say hundreds of thousands, something between 20 and 30% of veterans come home with post-traumatic stress and TBI. Certainly for some of these, take for instance the folks who've got severe penetrating brain injury. These are folks who, by the medical definition of a TBI, or by the fact that they've actually got shrapnel and metal in their brain, are severely affected by brain injury. Yeah, they may be incapacitated for life. But these other much larger numbers don't tell that same story. For instance, when you look at the way we diagnose post-traumatic stress, a lot of it has to do with the question of, have you ever experienced a certain set of symptoms? These symptoms are common, but do not, and in some cases take away from someone's ability to live everyday life, to perform in the workplace, at school. But they don't take away human potential, and that's something that's really critical to understand. And with the right resources, support, and treatment, these folks are not only up to sort of their prior standard before entering the military, but also benefit from all the experience and training that they get when they're in it. So last, I'll sort of close out with a little bit of what this sort of basic demographic information taught us about how philanthropists, donors, foundations really should be approaching veterans philanthropy. And I think the sort of core thing, if you take nothing else away from this hour and a half you're spending with us today, is that veterans are national assets. They're not a broken population. They're not a victim population. They're folks that, if not reintegrated well, will be a loss for the rest of society. We will not benefit, we will not be as great a country as we can be, and I'm not talking purely in sort of a patriotic sense, but economically, technologically, sociologically, in many ways, we will not benefit from the great talent pool that we've produced, and that we've sort of selected out of society to go and to fight our wars on our behalf. So as you consider ways to become involved with veterans, think about the question: does this treat them as assets, as folks who have a heck of a lot more to contribute, or does it treat them like we've sort of used them up and are now throwing them out and maybe feel sorry for them? Second, understand the incentives that your philanthropy creates. Right, it sort of gets back to this first question, but you're really asking yourself, does what I'm doing right now, does what I'm giving to, help get a veteran back on his or her feet, help them take advantage of the great talents that they have, or does it sideline them and tell them, you know what, we don't really think that you are able to perform anymore. So we will incentivize you to get out of the workforce. We will incentivize you to not participate. This one's a big one for me, having grown up in a military family and seeing sort of the way that that much of philanthropy and sort of the nonprofit community treats kids, but I think the lesson extends beyond it, is to make sure to address problems that are actually exacerbated by service or sort of disproportionately affect service members. There are lots of folks who are going around doing things that are nice and that are good for veterans, but they don't actually address the issues that are most salient for service members or that are created by military service. And last, and I think I might be close on time, as a donor, give in the way that you know how. If you've got a sort of pre-existing donor strategy, stick with that. See what you can do for veterans with what you already know. This is where you can find the book, and that's the cover of it. Thank you much.
Pull me up there, or can I just,
Either way.
I can just do it sitting down? Great. Afternoon, everybody. My name is Devin Holmes. I'm CEO of Warrior Gateway, and as previously noted, I am a civilian, even though my barber got a little aggressive with the clippers. Thank you. I'm actually a child of the Foreign Service. My parents were State Department, Foreign Service. I grew up overseas. And so when I think about some of the issues that I see this community facing, I can relate to the family unit side of it. I obviously can't relate to the veteran component, but to the spouses, the caregivers, the kids who move around, who feel sometimes disconnected from their communities, I think those challenges are similar in the diplomatic community, with children growing up in different countries and then coming back home and not necessarily feeling like they belong because their experiences are fundamentally different. I noted when we all sat down, what I thought was really interesting about this panel is that you actually have a mix of civilians and veterans up here, which I think is representative of what's happening in this sector, in this community. It has been for years. Several years ago, the term Sea of Goodwill was coined. Admiral Mullen talked a lot about the Sea of Goodwill, the outpouring of support, the people who want to support veterans and military families, nonprofits that have been started over the last 10 years, and there are many, many, many of them, existing ones and new ones that have been created. And I think what's interesting is that when we look at the issues and to sort of piggyback on some of the previous points, is a lot of the things we see in the media narrative sort of hit the emergency button. It's post-traumatic stress, it's homelessness, it's unemployment. And yes, these are issues that do need to get addressed, but they're also innovative organizations. I was out in New York this weekend for Veterans Day weekend, and we partnered with two what I think are spectacular organizations. They're small, they're new. The Veteran Artist Program and the Society of Artistic Veterans. These two organizations are trying to get veterans into the arts, musicians, painters, ballet dancers. It's not something you think about, I think, in the narrative. And when you think of a veteran, I don't think you think about a painter or a poet or an author. And yet they are those people as well. I sat down Monday morning to do a fundraising pitch, run a nonprofit. Your life is fundraising, and this CEO who spent about the last year researching the space and thinking about how to give into the space asked me a fundamental question, and I didn't have a good answer for him. And the question was this: he says, "It seems there are all these people out there that want to help, and every time I talk to the head of a nonprofit, I talk to someone about who should I be working with, who's good in this community. They say, well, this person is good, but that organization is good, but. And it seems like everybody is fighting over who should help the veterans, and yet they're not partnering and they're not collaborating with each other. And he said, as a donor, he finds that disturbing. He finds that challenging. He said, so why is this? What's the problem? Why can't you guys in this community figure out a way to partner and collaborate? And it's one of those questions you sit there and you go like, ooh, I'm just not going to win this battle. And my answer to him was, there is collaboration, there is partnership going on, but inherently with so many people rushing into the space and so much money being poured into the space, you create politics and you create this friction that hinders collaboration and partnership. And that, I think, is one of the challenges, not only as a nonprofit CEO, but also as a donor, to think about how do we break down those walls? How do we get people to work together across the spectrum of support within the community? And how do we leverage existing infrastructure that already exists? We don't necessarily need more food assistance programs if we leverage programs that were already built for the civilian need of food assistance or homelessness, so on and so forth. There are unique challenges, but there are also ones that existed before and exist in the civilian community. We should leverage that rather than recreate the wheel. Lastly, one of the things that we focus on, and I am a tech guy and I geek out on the data and the technology, is how do we start to measure performance? And this isn't just point-in-time performance, but this is longitudinal performance of an organization. How do we answer that question of the hundreds of thousands of organizations, and we have a list of about 200,000, and we think it's going to double. For those who don't know, there's 1.6 million plus or minus nonprofits registered in the United States. That's everything from your hospitals and schools to the little leagues and the churches, but it's a big number. How do we measure performance? How do we know who's good? And that's from the veteran, caregiver, family unit perspective. Where do I go for help? That's from the donor perspective. Who do I give money to? That's from a partnership perspective. Who do I want to work with? And by the way, I think as we look at this and how we measure performance and collect those metrics, we should also think about how do we measure the performance of the government programs serving this community as well. You don't get the pass just because you have a .gov on your website from that perspective. And one of the things that we're doing is we're working with several folks in the tech space. Our lead technology partner is Palantir. For those that know about them, you know they do really cool stuff with data that I can't talk about and they can't talk about, but we know they do cool stuff with data. And they have a philanthropy engineering team. And what I think is great about that is we have an outpouring now, the sea of goodwill, we'll say the technology side, outpouring from Silicon Valley saying, hey, let's take some of the best technology tools that we have developed for military use, for civilian use, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, let's apply it to this data problem. How do we catalog what I call the supply side of support in the equation? Who is everyone out there serving? We've got a lot of folks focusing on the demand side of need. How do we catalog this data and how do we better connect people with the organizations, measure their impact, and then direct not only more customers, if you will, to those organizations, but direct the funds, direct the partnerships to those organizations. And so that's really what we focus on, is the data and the technology and how do we put everything together. Thank you.
Well, first I want to thank Steve and Heritage and for hosting this, for talking about this. It is an important topic that hasn't, I think, been fully examined. So this opportunity to be here is much appreciated, and certainly getting the chance to review, Tom, your book and the effort that's gone into what the Philanthropy Roundtable is doing to make sure investors' dollars are used wisely. In a former life, I worked at the Manhattan Institute and got to know some folks at Philanthropy Roundtable, and it's a great service when someone is actually watching these organizations and what they do and giving donors a sense of how to give effectively. And certainly, Devin, your efforts in plugging vets in with opportunities is appreciated. So I run a group called Concerned Veterans for America. It is a veterans and military families organization. Our mission is very simple. It's to fight for the freedom here at home that we fought for overseas or while in uniform. It's a fundamental belief that when you raise your right hand to defend the Constitution, you swore an oath to defend something greater than yourself. And there's no reason why when you come home that service should stop. I think the impulse is still there. The incentives should be there. We wanted to be the kind of organization that channels that feeling and those sentiments toward action here on the home front. Before I ran Concerned Veterans for America, I ran a group called Vets for Freedom, which was an Iraq and Afghanistan war vets organization specifically. I didn't start the group, but I got affiliated with it right when I came back from Iraq in 2006. I was in Guantanamo Bay in 05, 06, or 04, 05, and then Iraq 2005, 2006, and came back feeling like those talking about the war here at home, politicians and pundits and others, were not representing fully the perspective of those who had been on the ground, seen what was happening, understood the difficulties, but saw our exposed domestic front as a place where we could lose a war if we lose public support so quickly before a new strategy like the surge or other was able to actually implement itself. So I stumbled into this vets thing as a first lieutenant back from Iraq saying, what can I do? I can write an op-ed, I can do a couple things here, and pretty soon it manifests itself in a group that was doing things to support the warfighter. But it was never for me, and can I start a group that will exist in perpetuity to grow a donor base for the sake of a donor base, to be a part of the VETS institution. This is my mission, this is a continuation of a mission, and I want to see that mission through. So I think I've come at the VSO or the veteran space a little bit differently over the years in stumbling into it. And certainly I appreciate the way Steve sort of framed Concerned Veterans for America, because when I came back from Afghanistan, in 2012, I got involved with CVA, and it certainly is a different sort of veteran service organization. We see our role as different than some of the more traditional veteran service organizations that exist. Not to take away from them at all, but that space is crowded. And we felt like there is a new opportunity to engage veterans in a different way. So I figured what I could add a little bit to this discussion, having demobilized 3 times off of active service, because I'm a National Guardsman to begin with, did 3 tours, the second of which was with the 101st on active duty, but the demobilization process was similar because I was going back to the reserves. I went through a very quick transition from warrior to veteran. This idea of your boots are dusty, you're sitting in Fort Dix in a briefing room on the way back, and you're going through your medical briefs and your checkout and getting information about what your options are and what your benefits are. And it is a very stark and immediate transition. I did it in 2004, I did it in 2012, and in 2005. But there's an 8-year gap where we learned a lot. They did a lot of things differently. There's a more gradual transition into civilian life. They've got the Yellow Ribbon program. It's a 30, 60, 90-day gradual reintegration process where you're with your unit more continually, so it's not an immediate. I came back from Iraq. I was back in New York City within 72 hours of being in Iraq. And so it's a stark transition that brings about responses that are not healthy. So we've learned a lot in that sense. But what didn't change was the feeling, the sentiment that I got, that it almost immediately went from hand up in sentiment to hand out. In that the VA representative, and this is not to disparage the Department of Veterans Affairs, but the incentive of that representative is to get every single member of that unit to sign up or claim or get a diagnosis or a rating for a disability. And I quote, one of the VA reps from my Iraq tour, if you so much as sneezed, file a claim. So you have a culture where you've been fighting for a mission, something greater than yourself for the last year with your buddies on your left and your right, and now it's time to cash that in. And I think that's an interesting transition, immediate trigger point where veterans are sort of, I remember looking around the room and some guys were sort of very much taken aback by that. Others were understood, okay, this is kind of how it is. Now I'm a veteran and I've given what I need to give to this country. So I think the transition process is part of it. A couple other things that lead to the hand up to hand out are, and this is not to disparage them, I'm a 10-year American Legion member myself and proud post 225 in Forest Lake, Minnesota, but the traditional VSOs feed that mentality as well. Because you join an organization that exists to perpetuate additional benefits. That when you come home and you realize what you've done and you understand the price of fighting for your freedom, you also see on the civilian side the civilian disability process. You see, food stamps and welfare, all these roles and ways in which regular Americans are exploiting a system without having given anything in the first place. And so there's a frustration to say, well, I certainly deserve what I get because of what I've done, and that's true. But it only reinforces this process of now it's time to be more dependent on the system as far as independent. And then you've got the public perception as well, that has been the overcompensation of learning from Vietnam about how we treat our veterans has also led to a perception that, of course, they're damaged, they're ticking time bombs, they're fundamentally broken, maybe a little whacked out in the head. And when you're continually told, are you all right, are you okay, do you need help, do you have PTSD, do you have TBI, it reinforces this feeling that, well, maybe I do, I'm a little off kilter. And whereas otherwise you would say, hey, you know, everybody deals with it. I had PT, and I appreciate the way you framed it as PTS, because everyone suffers from post-traumatic stress. Do I live with a disorder? I don't believe I do, but I know I went through a period where I was processing and dealing with the stress of what I dealt with. Understanding that bifurcation is difficult when you're raising awareness without adding stigmas. I want to quote something from the book, which I thought laid it out very well. He wrote, and I might paraphrase some of this, but it's more or less the sentiment, proving that one is disabled, and that's what we saw through the process of integrating with the VA, proving that one is disabled can trigger a powerful set of social constructs in a disabled person, his family, and his community. Applicants can start to rely routinely on others, personal aspiration can dry up, and passivity and dependence can become the norm. So the key question our group's trying to answer is, what is lost or what is missing when transitioned? Why does it go from hand up in sentiment sometimes to hand out? And I think it's because you go from a place where there is a higher calling, a sense of purpose, a sense of mission, to you're told now it's about what you can get. The missing piece is the sense of purpose. So the question we try to answer at Concerned Veterans for America, and we're not the silver bullet, we're one part of what a lot of groups do, is how can I continue my mission? How can I continue to serve? How can I continue to give back to something greater than myself? Our organization does it by getting vets involved in policy issues facing this nation. Some of it's vets related. The Department of Veterans Affairs, we've been very aggressive on that subject. But in working with Steve and James Carafano and others on defense spending issues, sequestration, the implications of our brothers in arms who are going to go again, what kind of military do we hand them? The threat of our national debt and the implications of our runaway spending and what that says about policies going forward, the erosion of freedom, our foreign policy, things those guys and gals in uniform really care about. Because I didn't sign up to join the military to get more stuff for myself when I came home. I signed up to be a part of this American experiment in human liberty. And what can I do when I come home to continue to contribute? So I think there are other groups with different missions that try to do the same thing. Things like Mission Continues or Team Rubicon that get vets engaged in whether it's disaster relief or community service, something greater than themselves that I think have gotten a good reaction, and there's something therapeutic in that action in and of itself that lends itself to more opportunities. So when we talked a little bit about why do traditional vets groups perpetuate some of this? I think it's because vets, like any other group, can become a special interest group. We're all prone to it. If it's our own sphere, we get very focused and myopically focused on what we can do to protect those that we know and the folks that we're involved with, and sometimes we go too far. So we need charities with a higher purpose and that empower, that train, that educate, that develop leaders, that frankly reinforce the things that we were taught in the military, reinforce the values that are good for corporations, that do break stigmas, that do provide leaders, that do build this country, because vets are not victims, they're national assets, as you said, Tom, especially post 9/11 veteran. I mean, vets of all generations, but when you've signed up an all-volunteer force knowing you're going to war, that takes a special type of person to do that I think can come back and should come back to be a leader in the community. So it's about not being dependent, it's about being creators, not self-interested sort of collectivists, but those that believe in industry and personal responsibility and responsible governance and freedom, the things that we fought for. So I just appreciate the approach. I think revisiting it is important, and we're one, at Concerned Veterans for America, one small sliver of trying to get vets reinvesting in their country and things that they originally signed up to defend. So thank you very much for having me.
All right, we have microphones available. When I call on you, please say who you are, stand up so that we can all hear you, and ask your question. And I always add that if at the end of 2 sentences I don't hear a question mark, then I'm going to ask you to sit down. Because if you really want to give a speech, let me know afterwards. We'll get you up here on a panel, and we can do it. But for now, we want to listen to these three. So I'm going to ask the first question. Those of you can think about it as you go forward. Assuming, and I do agree that, this generation isn't just looking for a handout, that they are men and women who have, by their volunteering in the first place, have made a decision that they're going to contribute. What are, and each of you can answer this, what are the three things that an average person, somebody who's not a veteran or who is, doing pretty well, what are the three things that an average person can do to help this effort of getting veterans not being dependent, but get them reintegrated into society? And whoever wants to go first can start speaking.
I don't know if I can come up with three off the bat, but I think part of it is going to sound odd, but sometimes you want to be treated normally. I don't want to be coddled with kid gloves. I don't want to be made to think, well, are you okay? Are you damaged? We had a Gold Star wife that was with us on our bus. We did a 3-week bus tour the last couple of across the country to talk about who we are in organization build. One of the women that joined us was Jane Horton. She's a Gold Star wife. Her husband was killed in Afghanistan in 2011, and she continually reinforces, just treat me normal, because every person that comes up to me is sobbing and wants to hug me and solve my problems. And it perpetuates the feeling that I have. Of course, the thanks and appreciation is good. I don't mean to take that away. But saying to a vet, hey, this is, appreciate you for who you are and what you do, and I want to give you every opportunity to compete just like anybody else, I think is important for them. And then I would also say mentorship. I mean, the willingness to, without coddling and being overbearing, say, hey, I really appreciate what you've done, and if there's a way that I can help you, this is what I do. I think there's small steps, person to person, that people can take that we sometimes pass over because we feel uncomfortable or we haven't served, or how can I relate? I think, and that's where there's some groups that our organization is partnered with, like American Corporate Partners, which is out of New York City, that links up veterans with mentors in Fortune 500 companies. There are private groups that are doing just that I think are certainly beneficial. That's only two, but I did the best I could.
Those are good ones. All right.
I like the statement you made about competing. And one of the things that I'll echo the sentiment of create the opportunity for an individual to show their strengths, show their skills, and compete at the same level as, we'll say, their civilian counterpart. The big point I think I would make in how do you help as just an average person from the nonprofit side is invest locally. My large nonprofit partners aren't going to like this, but I'm not a supporter of the $25 a month going to people who can raise a couple $100 million or $1 billion. They have the capacity to get institutional investment, whether it's foundation or corporate partnership, because they are at that scale, and let them go after that money. But the local organizations, of which there are many in your community, really are the boots on the ground, really are the ones that can have the most direct impact right off the bat. And finding those organizations and investing in them as an individual is where you can have the biggest impact. And let the big guys chase the big money and really support the small guys. Because like when we think about our economy and we think about small businesses, I mean, small businesses are the backbone. Invest in the small business of supporting veterans and military families, which are the local nonprofits. Invest locally, not at the big mega size. And I think that'd be my big point.
Okay. Tom?
I think you put me in a tough position because I work exclusively with private philanthropists
That's
and big
okay.
donors. But I agree wholeheartedly with what the other two here have said. And I just want to reinforce the point that, what we're saying is not that folks don't come home with challenges and troubles. They do. We're saying that doesn't take away from their inherent value as human beings and their ability to contribute. And just recognizing that is a huge step forward.
Okay. Yes, in the center in the back there.
Yes, hi, I'm Sean Riley with the American Legion Legislative Division. I agree with your assessment that sometimes the older service organizations can get too myopically focused on just getting more benefits. I'm just curious, what recommendation would you have to the old, this is specifically for Mr. Hegseth, what recommendation would you have for the older service organizations? How can we sort of change to do more like what you're talking about?
I feel like that's the million-dollar question for the Legion and the VFW and AMVETS and others that are fantastic organizations, built mostly of World War II and now Vietnam generation veterans. It was the first thing I did when I came back from Guantanamo Bay was sign up at my Legion post. And then finding more ways to actively engage and involve younger veterans, I think includes engaging on a broader array of issues, which institutionally is difficult because these are more top-down driven groups, driven by the current leadership that has a different perspective. I also think you've got groups dominated by, at this point, Vietnam veterans who, not to get too much into the weeds here, but there's this disconnect between World War II veterans and Vietnam veterans, and now that the Vietnam veterans are at the helm, they're addressing a set of issues that they felt like were ignored for quite some time. I would say, however, that Vietnam vets have been fantastic supporters of our generation, saying, never again will we allow that to happen. And so I don't have a bad word to say there. I just think there's a lot of generational gaps. There's immediate funding needs that posts have that are met through certain things that happened there that aren't as appealing per se to a young person who's got free time on a Saturday night to go do pull tabs and drink beer. Well, they drink beer, they just might not drink it there. So, I think it's an institutional challenge to find a broader array of issues in a unique space to get guys and gals involved. I've seen things like, I know the Legion has the Burn Pit run by a friend of mine, Mark Seavey, and they're trying to find, unique ways to reach a younger generation. And I know there's initiatives out there. I would say a willingness to partner too with a lot of groups. One of the things our group has faced is that as a newer group, we've taken on the policy from day one of we'll work with anybody. We'll work with anybody that wants to work with us on, and we've worked with groups that we disagree with on a lot of things, but we do on this narrow issue. And I know there's a tendency to sort of say, and the Legion's the biggest and the largest and the most prominent, to push everybody else away. And I think sometimes that creates barriers that don't need to exist, especially amongst young folks that would take a look at the Legion, but feel like it's very closed out.
I'd add that, I love the partnership point, and when I talk about leveraging existing infrastructure, you look at the Legion, look at VFW, collectively, you guys have millions of dollars of infrastructure, physical infrastructure, brand infrastructure, and the fact that that's not being used to help bring together at the local level, because the presence that you have at the local level is huge. And the fact that not only for veterans, but for the nonprofits in that community, that the Legion posts aren't turning themselves into the rally point for the nonprofits that want to support this community, that aren't traditional military nonprofits, don't really know the issues that well, to me is a massively missed opportunity. You could be the thought leaders in your community, and yet you're not. You could be the rally point for those nonprofits, yet you're not. You could be the rally point for the investors in your community, yet you're not. The infrastructure you have and the opportunity here is huge, and yet year after year, and I've only been in the space for 5 years, but year after year I just watch it go by, and I watch it go by again, and it's frustrating, because I know there are hundreds of thousands of organizations that could leverage everything that you've learned from the previous generations and really create those local models like we see around the country. And one of the best ones I think that's out there is what is happening down in Augusta, Georgia with the Augusta Warrior Project and Jim Lorraine running that. They've really done a great job, but how do you scale that? Well, the folks who are already at scale that we don't need to scale to, it's you and VFW posts. Let's leverage that. And yet it's probably the $100 million question, because we haven't figured out how to break into that. And a lot of us have had those conversations.
Tom, have anything you want to add?
Nope, I'm on board with all those.
I'm going to add one. Since I'm a veteran, I get to talk about some of this stuff too. With World War II, we focused on all the good things, all the good guys, all the heroes. And frankly, there were people that were just as badly damaged emotionally and physically in that generation as there were in any other war. War does that to you. But we basically focused so much on all the good things, which was very positive. We didn't even acknowledge that other stuff existed. When things started coming up like alcoholism or other health problems, frankly, we didn't even associate it with the war most of the time. We just said, oh yeah, that's Bill, he's got that issue. With Vietnam, we flipped it on its head, and all we focused on were the negative things. And frankly, a lot of the people who didn't have any problems, who reintegrated perfectly fine, maybe little hiccups here and there, they kind of dissociated themselves with it because everybody thought the entire vet population was John Rambo, the damaged vet, and was going to explode at any moment. Well, now with this generation, we're kind of splitting the difference. We recognize the hero aspect. We recognize the numbers of people that are coming back just fine and jumping right back into things, the Pete's of the world. But we also recognize there's a lot of folks out there that got issues. Some of them are very obvious because of the missing limbs and things like that, but a lot of them are the TBI and the other ones that we can't see. So, I mean, again, the large veteran service organizations, you've done that already. You dealt with the World War II generation. Now you've dealt with the Vietnam era generation. You've got the experience of both. We need both those experiences to properly deal with the present generation. You guys have the repository of information. We just got to get it moving. All right. Let me get this young lady right here, and then we'll get you, sir, and then you. Right there. Right, yep, you.
Thanks, sorry. My name is Lindsay, and I run a nonprofit called Luke's Wings, and we provide airline tickets for wounded warriors and their families to visit during the recovery process. So it's a very specific time frame, and I kind of a specific question for my organization, maybe mostly towards Thomas based on your information, but I am seeing a lot of donors asking what's next and what do we do about the children and their college education and this and that. And just wondering if you have any advice for me in terms of there are still many thousands of actively recovering wounded warriors who aren't veterans yet, and they're not ready to leave the hospital. So I don't know, do you have any advice on how to keep that message going, that we still need to support our currently recovering wounded warriors?
Sure. I mean, what I showed earlier is an issue of proportions, right? There is a massive proportion who don't have this experience, but that doesn't mean that the thousands of folks who do have it should get less attention. In fact, because of the situation that they're in, they need more. But I would also say that, to donors who are asking you to sort of go beyond an area where you know what you're doing and have confidence in your ability to deliver, say, look, that's not really what we do. Maybe we should find a great partner for you to go to for that, for that issue. I think a problem I see with a lot of nonprofits is that they, instead of choosing one thing to focus on and become really great at, try and tackle everything under the sun and end up providing lots of mediocre services that don't really change people's lives, and that kind of ticks donors off and it ticks me off. Instead, focus on doing one or two things really well and things that you have a real specialty in, and donors will get that.
Okay, this gentleman in front right here with the glasses.
Thanks. I'm Kurt Lining with the National Trust Wounded Warriors. Devin focused on you and your haircut. My guy did a worse job. So.
Looking good. We're very aerodynamic.
Yeah. So am I. Devin, I followed your work in Illinois on the joining forces. Question is, how many other states are as proactive as Illinois has been in implementing Warrior Gateway's database?
Yeah, it's a great question, and every state's a little bit different. Illinois and what Erica Borgren's doing there is spectacular. And she represents, well, she is the next generation of state directors of Veterans Affairs. She's an OIF, West Pointer, if I remember correctly. She went to Annapolis. Sorry, Erica. I'm pretty sure she's West Pointer, though. And what's happening in Nevada, they've done something very similar. We've found that Colorado has really pushed the envelope, and they're doing a lot of great work out there at the state level. One of the interesting things is that we've had far more success, and again, I'm not going to beat up on 800 Vermont Street either, but we've had far more success at the state level than we have at the federal level. working with state directors of Veterans Affairs and talking about how do you institute technology solutions, how do we start to share data, and make sure that we're collaborating across that. Those 3 states right off the bat are leaders from the technology data perspective. But there are other innovative programs going on in states around the nation, whether it's trying to get a postcard filled out that gets sent back to California when you're exiting and transitioning out, so that's the old school way of notifying the California Department of Veterans Affairs that you're coming home, to free license plates for veterans in Georgia, which is a different way to collect data because now you know the veteran through DMV, now we can connect. Though connecting state agencies is as hard as connecting federal agencies in terms of sharing data. So we've seen a lot of innovation. We've got a new initiative where we're really trying to put together a coalition and say, why are we not able to share information, and how can we share it better? Because fundamentally, if we all have a different playbook, then you ask 6 people the same question, you get 6 answers, and you know who loses out? It's the veteran asking those 6 people. There should be a consolidated data source of who is the supply side, and that's one of the things that we're working on. VA, DoD are working on it. We're trying to do a public-private partnership. It takes time. My observation is, having worked in Silicon Valley, we think in 30-day, 60-day increments. Having worked in Washington, D.C., I think in 10-year increments. And I'd like to be closer to the Silicon Valley side, but I know it takes a long time to create those relationships.
Okay, gentleman right here.
Hi, how you doing? My name is Dave Foltz. I'm not representing an organization. I'm just a veteran here on my lunch break. Last night I was at the DC Young Republicans monthly meeting. They asked, hey, how many vets in the room? Please stand up. I think 2 guys stood up. Now most of these young people were staffers, working on the Hill, federal employees. Now that's kind of disheartening for me. There's only 2 people here. And I know there are lots of resources out there to get vets linked up into civilian jobs. As a matter of fact, Starbucks is hiring, 10,000 employees over the next, 10 years. And that's great, but I was a rifle platoon leader in the Cornwall Valley, and I don't want to serve coffee. So what I really want to do is to continue to serve the country. Now I want to do that within either state or federal government. Now can you tell me what ways, or are there any opportunities, ways to enter into the federal government, or on the policy side, whether it be legislative, judicial, executive branch, how can vets break into there? Because I did not have the opportunity to campaign and network my way into a job past 4 years because I was in Afghanistan for 3 of them. So without saying USAJobs.gov or FedsHireVets.gov, how can vets break their way and continue to serve?
Well, just to back up one thing, in one direction, I'm also an infantry officer and, work with a lot of infantrymen that I still stay in touch with who say, hey, I've been serving, now I'm here. How do these things translate? And obviously you understand the intangibles that should and ought make you a fantastic employee. And I think hopefully why Starbucks and Walmart and all these other companies are doing it is because it's ultimately a benefit to their bottom line when they've got competent, intelligent, healthy workers working for them. So I hope it's more of less of a warm glow and more of a bottom line. That's the right incentive, frankly. I think what we don't do well as service members serving is build a network that kid you're competing against has been doing in college or has been doing with that first job, networking in different ways, going to events, socializing. That's how you get most of the jobs you get in some context or get where you want to be. So one of the groups we've partnered with, and this is just one example, but I think it exemplifies the type of approach that needs to be had, a group called rallypoint.com. It's started by a guy, Yanan Weiss, a friend of mine, was a special SF guy, went to Harvard Business School, left to start rallypoint.com. It's effectively a LinkedIn for the military. And what it does is it's supposed to be beneficial for you while you're in the Army or in the military, but also afterwards. So when you're in the military, you link up with all the people in your unit, and then every 2 years everybody goes all over the place, and you have no idea where they are. Well, unless they're still in that database, and now you can say, so it's supposed to help you while you're in to say, well, I'd really like to be a comm specialist. Oh, my buddy who was in this unit is there now. He could probably find me a slot, and I could transition over there. Which the military is like civilian world in some senses. Yeah, it's bureaucratic, but if you know the right guy, he can fill the slot for you. But then when you get out, it is also a resource. You could say, wow, my commander, my platoon leader back in the day is now, got out and he works at FedEx in this place, in this area. Wow, you've got an immediate connection with that guy that gets you in the door the way a networking event, way more than a networking event that somebody had in DC. So the network is there, it's just how do you harness it? And I think Rally Point's doing yeoman's work at the beginning here to try to create, and so they've just opened it up to veterans to sort of retroactively go back in. And it's a startup, I mean, but they've got the right people behind it, they've raised a bunch of money to build it out. Now it's an awareness issue, letting vets and military service members know about it. But I think it's there. It's just about eventually leveraging it. Right now, I think we need some states have figured it out. The federal government's figured out in some way how do you make sure accreditation is for those maybe aren't infantrymen, if they're medics or mechanics, to make sure that if you were trained to be a medic in the military, you don't have to come back as a civilian and take 101, stop the bleeding, because you don't have the civilian accreditation. Let's make sure those translate from the military to civilian service so that we're not taking that medic who's been trained for 5 years and putting him at ground zero next to some kid out of high school who's never touched a patient before. That's really frustrating when you come home too. It doesn't necessarily apply to the infantry per se, but I think there's ways we could set vets up for success better. And then I mentioned mentorship before, American Corporate Partners. I think getting you linked up with someone that already has that network and create a direct bond with them in the immediate term. I mean, I would encourage you to look at American Corporate Partners as one of them. I don't have any interest in them per se. There's other groups that do that to help you get a leg up at this point. But I would also thank you for what you did in the Korengal Valley as someone who's read and understands that area well, not having been there, but having studied it. I appreciate what you've done.
I'm going to echo that from the civilian side and say network. My two examples, one, I was given the opportunity to start Warrior Gateway by General Boyd, and he got my resume and it passed through 8 different people before he got it. So it was a conversation with a friend of mine who worked at Booz Allen, knew I was leaving Cisco Systems, wanted to do something different, philanthropic potentially, that went to the next guy and the next girl and the next guy. Next thing you know, a retired 4-star's calling me saying, "Hi, my name's Chuck, can we talk?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure." I didn't know who he was. And the other thing is, the other example is, a year ago, I was looking sort of at our budget, what we were trying to do, and we really needed some more marketing and some more branding. And so I got on LinkedIn, and I just started searching for people, and I randomly just emailed the owner of a small branding firm in St. Louis. I said, "Hey, I'm Devin, this is what I do, and I see you do branding. Can we have a conversation? We're looking for some help." Out of that, I got 200 hours of pro bono. So don't be afraid, because a lot of people don't do it because I think they fear the rejection of, "No, I can't help you." There are resources out there, right? Whether it's LinkedIn, Rally Point, even, by the way, Facebook. Just emailing someone saying, "Hey, I have a question." When you ask for advice, especially when you're job searching, when you ask for advice, that's actually the best entree into getting a connection to a hiring manager or a CEO who can say, "You know what, I got a buddy who knows somebody that's looking for someone like you." So it's all about the networking.
I'm sorry, but yeah, it's also that fine line you were talking about from just, I don't want to ask for a handout. I'm not looking for a handout, I'm looking for, and I'm speaking from my experiences, but here I'm representing a few other vets.
And that's not what I
It's a
hear.
fine line.
That's not what I hear when you ask that question. You're saying, how do I be smart about it, intentionally finding the opportunities that I know I'm ready for, based on what I've done? And I think that Devin makes a fantastic point. You've got something people want, people relate to. People say, "Man, this dude was out there in the thick of it. And if I could do something to help him, I'd feel good about myself. I'd feel good about the contribution I made today." So don't be afraid to say, "Hey, I'd love to grab coffee. I'd love to pick your brain. I'd love to find out how you got where you got." There are very few people that are going to turn down an infantry platoon leader in the Korengal Valley who wants to have coffee with them, including higher echelons than you would think. And so don't be afraid to leverage that. That's an asset you have, that you're not, it's not hand-outing, it's being smart about it.
Tom?
Completely agree. I think military service members are taught to be humble in their service. That doesn't work as well in the civilian world. Don't undervalue the assets that you have.
Okay, right here.
Connect with us on LinkedIn.
Ann Stone, an advisor to the National Trust, and I want to say you all are fabulous. Thank you, Heritage, for putting this on and introducing us to such wonderful people doing incredible work, and we hope to be helping what you're doing, actually. A couple points or a couple questions. The Rally Point, do you know if they're going to, like, the elected officials, state level and federal, and getting them to join the network if they were vets?
I don't know, but I can find out.
They should, obviously, and also the corporate world. I hope they are reaching out and making them part of that network. That'll help address exactly what he's talking about in terms of being able to get in the door. You mentioned 200,000 nonprofits that I guess circulate through the military world. We had heard through a recent white paper, it was about 40,000. So I take it the 200,000 are groups outside of ones that are specific to military.
Correct.
But the
Yeah.
ones that are specific to military, is that 40,000 figure real? And how do you sort out the groups that are frankly charlatan, that are in business just to make money for the staff and the consultants and not for the vets?
But I think I might defer to folks. I have an opinion on that. The numbers are the numbers, right? I mean, I know the 40,000 number, and it's how they came up with it. It's military specific or veteran in the mission statement, but 40,000, 200,000, look, there's 1.6 million nonprofits, ballpark, we know that, IRS knows that. And there are ones out there that are huge, like Easter Seals, United Way, Volunteers of America, and they have military programs. And then there's small folks, vets, Canines for Vets, that they only work with vets and everybody in between. The reality is we all have needs in our lives, and it's identifying those needs and then identifying how you solve those needs. From an investor and donor perspective, how do you know? That's a really hard question. It's something that we've been working on, that we're bringing together a coalition to work on. Today, a lot of what occurs when I talk to folks, either at the institutional level, the foundation level, they have internal metrics, and every foundation does it a little bit differently, that they ask you, you report. I write a lot of grants, so we're always reporting stuff. That's their metric. We know we have the Guide Stars of the world and Charity Navigators, and we work with them. That's a financial metric, but it's also partly based on how good your accountant is at putting the numbers in the right box. So what we don't have that is across the board are good point-in-time and longitudinal performance metrics on what was the impact of my service or product on your life, whether it was, I need to build you a house, you have a house. I need to provide you counseling, you have to measure that over years. That's something that we have struggled with for years in this space, and I think arguably the nonprofit sector struggles with, that we're trying to address with partners. The big, from the big Easter Seals all the way down, everyone internally measures, and the question is, how do you sort of make that into a standardized measurement across the board? And that's a real challenge. I couldn't tell you today who the top 5% are. I mean, I have an opinion on it, but I can't back it up with data. And if you can't back it up with data, it's just an opinion.
I'm more concerned with that 50% that is sucking money out.
Well, and one of the things we've talked a lot about and we've played with is the Yelpification, Angie's List model, right? I mean, we're not asking our customers whether they think we're any good or any, having impact on their lives. And that's an interesting cultural aspect, I think, both in the military community as well as the nonprofit community. People don't really like to talk bad about nonprofits unless they truly are scam artists. Because you're helping vets, and so unless you're stealing the money, I'm not going to trash talk you because you're helping vets. Well, okay, but if I'm not good at my job, then we need to find a way to either have me improve, have me go away, or, this is the other thing, consolidation. I think that you're going to see over the next couple of years some consolidation, the nonprofit equivalent of mergers and acquisitions. Because from a fundraising perspective, you need to do that. But this is the core of what I think is one of the big issues on the nonprofit side of determining the top end, the bottom end, and how do we bring it all together. But he's done a lot more research on it.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I think, one of the answers is, well, every foundation values things differently. I will disagree with you. I don't think the majority of the problems we see are folks outright stealing. We've had some really high-profile cases. I think we've got folks doing things that don't necessarily work than doing nothing at all. This is an incredibly young and unsophisticated space. And in the last 13 years, we've had this ballooning of people who care a lot, but many of whom have started up small mom and pop shops that don't have the background to, one, understand necessarily what their program is doing and whether it's working, And two, if they've invented something new, to evaluate it. Some of the best funders that the ones I admire most, take an approach of saying, you know what, all we're going to do is fund pilots and evaluate those, so that by the end of the day, if we've spent a couple $1 million and this doesn't work, we'll know more than 98% of the field out there. Because most folks, what they'll measure is sort of inputs or outputs, right? We have distributed $10 million worth of financial aid in the past 7 years. Okay, that's an input, sure. That's a good job. You can cut some checks. Some of them can say, okay, well we've had we've been able to distribute 1,500 Segways. I'm not picking on any groups that distribute Segways. I think those are some of the most wonderful assistive technologies that exist. But you say, okay, well you've done that, but answering the real goals of well, did that help this person get a job that they wouldn't otherwise get to do? Did giving someone this new form of mental health treatment or access to health care actually affect whether they used and benefited from these services? Well, heck, we don't know. And I think there's ripe opportunity for research, and we're starting to see more and more of this. Penn State just announced the opening of a new research institute on this. But we're seeing more and more focus on research and the ability to actually evaluate whether programs do better than sort of the null hypothesis. So that to me is sort of the bigger issue than folks actively stealing. It's people just don't know what they're doing.
And I would just encourage you, and this may violate some sort of rule or something, but I'm sort of the neophyte, but if you run into an organization that has done something you think is unscrupulous or just really egregiously poor at what they're doing, let these guys know. I mean, they can't do anything about it specifically, but they can sure be aware of it and take that into consideration. And all of the service organizations, get the word out. When there's a bad player out there, their reputation should, people should know. Okay, I'm going to exercise the moderator's right, and I'm going to ask you guys, and this will be the final wrap-up. This is your chance to do your final thing. Given that we have a particularly tight fiscal environment now in our country, what is the single thing that, this is your opportunity to address the audience and everybody who comes online at the recorded version. What's the single thing you want them to know that they should be doing to work in a positive way, assuming people want to be positive, because I think they do?
When you think about veterans 10 years from now, do not gauge their success based on how many programs you get them signed up for, but how much earned success they have had. And anything you do on their behalf, and anything you do to help them, should be directed towards doing that.
You got a good answer?
I was trying to whittle it down to one thing.
I noticed he's pretending to write things down on the paper.
I'm still trying to figure out what a null hypothesis is. But, no, I think it's, first of all, knowing that, to the null hypothesis piece, I mean, most people who start organizations and groups don't know what it means or what it takes to start a group or get involved. I mean, I was literally a first lieutenant when I got in charge of Vets for Freedom, and we built it to 95,000 members and raised $8 million and was doing nothing but fundraising and was go. Didn't really know. Boy, I wouldn't want to think what Philanthropy Roundtable would have thought of our efforts and how efficient they are. I mean, really, it's so much of this is an impulse of goodwill, that people truly want to do the right thing, haven't necessarily been trained or have the management skills to do it. So as much as the measurements and the metrics are important, remembering that most people's heart are in the right place and the extent to which you can give them guidance and assets to be more effective at what they do. And then I would double down on the local aspect too. I mean, we're a national organization, but I work with a group called the Eagles Healing Nest in Sauk Center, Minnesota, in rural Minnesota, and they've opened up a place where vets can go and get the care that the VA is not providing at the local facility. And they've got 40 vets that live there right now. And the vets pay their way, and they're all about, we're not giving a handout, it's a hand up, and you pay to stay here, and you work, and you maintain it, and you get a job, and you stay sober, and you do all these things that the government's not doing. It's the best kept secret in Minnesota. And so all I can do is try to push the word out as best I can about Eagles Healing Nest and Eagles Healing Nest and what it's doing. So finding those local ones and being willing to really get your hands dirty and involved with them, you can have so much more value. I mean, the other ones are great too, but you can have so much more of a direct person-to-person impact than some of the national ones.
So I've got one thing, but it's one thing per category, and I have 3 categories. To the nonprofits out there, focus on your core competencies. Focus on why you were set up and what you're good at. Don't expand your mission just because you think you can get more money for it. Focus on what you're good at. Stay with the core competency. Because I guarantee you, if you think someone else isn't doing it, they are doing it, you just don't know about it. Become really great at what you do, and the funding will come for that. To the individuals and the donors, you are the big stick to force the partnership. If you're giving money, whether you're giving $1 million, $100 million, or $1, if you don't ask the question, how are we going to use this, and are you partnering with other people, then you're failing at your job. You can force nonprofits to think about collaboration and partnership. Why? Because we rely on your funds. You are the lifeline. So force that issue. And then to the veterans, from the civilian perspective, my advice to veterans would be talk to civilians. Keep talking to civilians. They may not understand you. It might take time to find the language, but talk to us. Network with us. Connect with us on LinkedIn. Email us. People do want to know, they do want to help. There is a language barrier sometimes. I don't understand what you went through because I wasn't there and I haven't served. But if we keep talking, eventually we'll find a common ground, we'll find a common language, and I'll be able to provide you advice, help, employment, whatever it is, friendship, just by that conversation. So keep talking. I know it's frustrating. It's frustrating for us. It took me a while to learn the language when I started Warrior Gateway. But just keep the conversation going. Move through the frustration. Connect with your civilian counterparts in your community. There are more civilians than there are veterans. You have to make as much of a proactive effort to communicate with us as we do with you. So please just keep talking to the civilians.
Well, this has been a rich discussion. I'll be honest with you, it went in directions I didn't think it would, and it's better than what I anticipated. That's always nice to have it come out that way. I would encourage all of you that are here physically as we break up to get the information from these gentlemen, both for their organizations and to help those of you that are representing other organizations build that partnership that was mentioned. Please double check and get the website so you can get Tom's book, Serving Those Who Served. It's an important resource for you, and I think it'll be useful. And please join me in thanking the panel for what they've shared. And thank you all once again for being here at Heritage, and have a great day.